summer 1943, Texas. The heat shimmered across the camp fences as hundreds of German prisoners stepped down from the train, their boots crunching against the dry gravel. They expected hostility, deprivation, and punishment. Instead, the first thing that caught their eyes was a red and white sign above a small wooden shack inside the compound. Coca-Cola. 5 cents. The guards moved casually, speaking little, and pointed the exhausted men toward the barracks. But some prisoners, still stunned from their journey, froze when they saw American soldiers walking away from the shack with glass bottles filled with dark, bubbling liquid, ice clinking inside. The same bottles were handed to laughing children outside the fence who had gathered to watch the new arrivals. It was a sight that seemed absurd, impossible, and deeply insulting all at once. Coca-Cola was a name they had heard whispered before the war, a symbol of decadent America mentioned in propaganda leaflets. In Germany, it had disappeared quickly once the war began, replaced by synthetic drinks and bitter substitutes. To see it here, flowing freely and sold to anyone, even offered to prisoners, struck them like a cruel joke. One young corporal recorded later in his secret diary that he thought it was a trick, a show designed to break their pride. "It must be propaganda," he wrote. "They cannot possibly waste such things on us." Yet when the first prisoner was handed a cold bottle, condensation dripping down the glass in the sweltering heat, he realized it was no illusion. The liquid hissed as the cap was removed, the first taste burning slightly on his tongue before dissolving into sweetness. For men who had lived on ersatz coffee brewed from roasted acorns and sugar beets, this was not just a drink. It was proof of a different reality, one that clashed violently with everything they had been told about a starving, weak America. At that very hour, back in Hamburg and Dresden, their families stood in ration lines holding paper coupons for a small piece of black bread or boiled roots passed off as coffee. Children at home stirred thin soups of cabbage and water. Mothers rationed sugar down to a spoonful a week. The prisoners who tasted Coca-Cola in Texas knew that their families would never believe the story. They would think it was a fantasy or enemy lies, because how could the same America that dropped bombs on their cities be so rich it could spare luxuries for the men it had captured? The realization sank in slowly but brutally. Coca-Cola was not a luxury in America. It was ordinary. It was everywhere. It was produced by the millions of bottles, shipped in refrigerated trucks, loaded onto trains, and even carried in crates across oceans to soldiers fighting thousands of miles away. What to Americans was nothing more than a refreshment, to German prisoners was an unmistakable message. You are fighting a nation whose abundance is beyond imagination. This single bottle of soda, cold and sweet in the middle of a prisoner camp, carried more psychological weight than 1,000 propaganda leaflets. It told them that while their children drank ersatz coffee brewed from roots, their captors drank and distributed Coca-Cola as casually as water. In that moment, many began to understand that the war they believed they could win was already lost, not on the battlefield, but in the factories and bottling plants that never stopped running. By 1940, the Third Reich had already begun to ration food, but by 1942 and 1943, the shortages had grown so severe that life for ordinary German families was a daily struggle against hunger. Official rations promised bread, meat, sugar, and coffee, but the reality was far more grim. The bread was increasingly bulked with potato flour or sawdust fillers, meat shrank to a few ounces a week, sugar was cut to less than 300 grams per person per month, and coffee disappeared altogether. In its place came Ersatzkaffee, a bitter brown liquid brewed from roasted barley, acorns, or sugar beets. Housewives queued for hours to receive these meager allocations, clutching ration coupons that were often worthless by the time they reached the front of the line. In cities like Hamburg, Leipzig, and Cologne, children grew gaunt, their ribs visible through thin shirts, their daily diet reduced to boiled turnips and watery cabbage soup. The contrast with propaganda was brutal. Newspapers and radio broadcasts declared that Germany stood strong, that the nation was enduring sacrifices to achieve final victory. Posters showed smiling families holding steaming mugs of ersatz coffee as though it were a proud national beverage. Yet every sip reminded them that the war had stripped away the taste of real coffee, a product once imported freely from Brazil and Africa, now inaccessible under Allied blockade. Sugar cubes became treasures hidden away for special days, and fruit was a distant memory. Bananas and oranges vanished, replaced by the sour taste of sauerkraut. In rural areas, farmers hid potatoes in cellars to avoid confiscation, and city dwellers grew vegetables in every available patch of soil. For the men who later became prisoners in America, these memories were raw. They remembered writing letters home to wives and children, describing how they craved nothing more than a slice of bread with butter, a cup of milk, or a spoonful of sugar. In Stalingrad, soldiers had been reduced to eating horse meat, scraped from frozen carcasses, or melting snow for water. At the front in North Africa, rations were little better, with thin soup, hard black bread, and dried vegetables. Even officers complained that their daily fare was poorer than what they had known as children in the 1920 seconds. And still, propaganda insisted that Germany was strong, that America was weak, decadent, and starving. Yet the blockade statistics told another story. By 1943, Germany's imports had collapsed by more than 80%. Oil, coffee, cocoa, and sugar were the most visible losses, while America not only consumed these luxuries in vast quantities, but exported them to allies and even distributed them to prisoners of war. German leaders told their people that suffering was a badge of honor, proof of sacrifice, but the reality was that scarcity was crippling morale. Hunger gnawed at the home front, and letters from wives often pleaded for help, describing children fainting in school from lack of food, or old parents collapsing in ration queues. It was against this background of deprivation that the experience of German POWs in the United States became incomprehensible. When they first saw Coca-Cola in American camps, the shock was amplified by the memory of Ersatzkaffee. While their families were forced to boil acorns to create a bitter brown liquid, these men were handed bottles of cold soda fizzing with sugar and caffeine. The psychological blow was not simply about taste. It was about what it represented, the sheer industrial power of a nation that could make sweet, carbonated drinks flow like water, even during a global war. The very existence of Coca-Cola in wartime America was proof that scarcity had never truly touched the United States, while in Germany scarcity defined existence. For the prisoners, each sip of Coca-Cola was a reminder of what their loved ones did not have. It was impossible not to think of wives boiling ersatz coffee back home, of children scraping bowls for the last bits of potato. While in Texas, the enemy tossed away surplus bread and poured sugar into drinks for children and prisoners alike. The deprivation they had endured and the deprivation their families still faced created a sense of betrayal by their own leaders. They began to understand that Germany had entered a war it could never supply, while America fought with an economy so abundant that even luxuries remained commonplace. By the time the German prisoners arrived in America, Coca-Cola was more than just a soft drink. It had become a logistical weapon, a symbol of American abundance and industrial coordination. When Roosevelt declared in 1941 that every American serviceman, no matter where he was stationed, should be able to buy a bottle of Coca-Cola for 5 cents, the company responded with a wartime mobilization of its own. 64 new bottling plants were built around the world during the war, each one designed to follow American forces wherever they went. These plants were not luxuries. They were considered part of the war effort, supported by the War Department, and supplied with sugar and glass even when other industries faced strict rationing. The scale was staggering. By 1944, Coca-Cola was producing more than 5 billion bottles annually, shipped by rail, by truck, and in cargo holds of ships moving across the Atlantic and Pacific. For German prisoners who had been told that America was on the brink of collapse, the realization that the enemy could spend precious resources producing sweet soda in wartime was devastating. In Germany, every ounce of sugar was reserved for the most basic needs, and even hospitals faced shortages. In America, Sugar was flowing into bottles of Coca-Cola distributed not only to soldiers, but also to civilians, and even to enemy prisoners. The numbers underscored the difference. The United States harvested more than 6 million tons of sugar in 1943, while German production and imports together managed less than a tenth of that amount. The industrial base behind Coca-Cola. The glass factories producing millions of bottles. The bottling plants operating on 3 shifts. The refrigerated trucks crisscrossing the continent revealed the true power of American logistics. For the men behind the wire in Texas and Oklahoma, the Coca-Cola bottle was therefore not simply a beverage. It was a lesson in production capacity. The bottle was the end product of a chain that stretched from Cuban sugar plantations to Midwestern corn syrup refineries, from glass foundries in Pennsylvania to bottling plants in Georgia, and finally to the small wooden shack in the POW camp. Every sip reminded them that their captors commanded a supply network so vast that it could deliver cold soda across oceans while still supplying armies of millions with food, fuel, and weapons. Some prisoners later admitted that the experience felt like mockery. They had been told for years that the American economy was soft, that democracy bred inefficiency, that decadent nations would collapse under hardship. Yet here they were, drinking bottles capped by machines that sealed thousands per minute, part of an industry so resilient that it had not slowed even in the middle of a global war. One officer recalled that the first time he saw crates of Coca-Cola being unloaded from a truck at the camp gates, he felt physically ill. It was not the drink itself, he said, but what it meant. If they had enough to give us Coca-Cola, then they had more than enough to bury us. The military understood the psychological impact as well. For American troops, Coca-Cola was a taste of home, a morale booster in foxholes from Normandy to New Guinea. For German prisoners, it was an unintentional weapon of psychological warfare. Each time they saw American guards casually toss away a half-empty bottle, the contrast with their families back home deepened the wound. While German children drank bitter acorn brew, American children left sugary soda unfinished. The message was unmistakable. America's industrial engine was so powerful that even luxuries were ordinary, even to enemies. The Coca-Cola story was just one small thread in the tapestry of American production, but to the men who experienced it firsthand, it became a symbol of something much larger. It was not a matter of taste or comfort. It was industrial arithmetic, made visible in glass bottles filled with caramel-colored liquid. It was the arithmetic of victory. In Germany, the word Ersatz became a symbol of the home front. Ersatz bread bulked with ground potatoes and straw flour. Ersatz butter made from margarine flavored with chemicals. Ersatz coffee brewed from roasted barley, chicory, acorns, or sugar beets. What had once been a word for substitution now defined everyday life. Housewives queued for hours to collect a few ounces of this bitter substitute, and when they poured it into chipped porcelain cups, they pretended it was the real thing. Yet everyone knew it was not. The taste was harsh, the color weak, and the aroma only a shadow of true coffee. Children born during the war grew up never knowing what real coffee smelled like. For them, the bitter Ersatz drink was all they had. By contrast, America poured resources into real sugar, real coffee, and even luxuries like soft drinks. In 1943, the United States produced more than 6 million tons of sugar. Brazil, Colombia, and other allies shipped millions of pounds of coffee beans across the Caribbean into American ports without interruption. Even under rationing, American civilians received more sugar and coffee per month than German soldiers at the front. And behind those statistics stood factories, refineries, and shipping networks that never stopped moving. The Coca-Cola Company alone used hundreds of thousands of tons of sugar annually, enough to supply entire German provinces with sweetener. The comparison was devastating when German POWs confronted it directly. Some recalled that the first sip of Coca-Cola in an American camp felt like betrayal because it tasted of everything their families had lost. One prisoner described it bluntly, "I could not drink it without thinking of my wife boiling roots to make coffee back home." The sweetness of the soda was more than flavor. It was proof that the war Germany thought it could win had already been decided by industrial power. If America could flood the world with real coffee, real sugar, and bottled Coca-Cola while building 100,000 aircraft a year, what hope did Germany have with its ersatz drinks and ration cards? The numbers drove the point home. In 1942, German civilians received only 250 grams of coffee substitute per month, often stretched with roasted acorns. In the same year, the average American soldier consumed nearly a pound of real coffee every week. The Army Quartermaster Corps ordered 250 million pounds of coffee beans annually, enough to give every soldier 2 cups a day. For sugar, the contrast was even sharper. German rations averaged less than 20 pounds of sugar per person per year. In America, per capita sugar consumption remained over 70 pounds despite the war. Even when rationing limited civilians to a half-pound a week, American soldiers and prisoners of war ate more sugar in their desserts than many German children saw in a year. The psychological impact of these differences cannot be overstated. To the German mind, taught to believe that sacrifice built strength and that America was too weak to endure hardship, the sight of abundance was shattering. Seeing Coca-Cola crates unloaded beside the camp kitchen, while remembering bitter ersatz coffee at home, felt like an indictment of everything they had been told. One POW later admitted, "We believed we were the hard men of Europe, surviving on substitutes." But when we saw that America still had the real thing for everyone, even for us as captives, we realized we had misjudged the entire war. The contrast between ersatz and Coca-Cola was therefore not trivial. It was a metaphor for the larger struggle. Germany substituted because it had to. America indulged because it could. Germany rationed and starved, while America expanded and exported. In every sip, in every discarded bottle, in every spoonful of sugar stirred into coffee, German prisoners saw the material reality of defeat. They understood that their family's suffering was not the price of victory, but the evidence of inevitable loss. The shock of Coca-Cola was only the beginning. Every day inside the American camps drove the lesson deeper, because the prisoners quickly discovered that their entire diet exceeded anything they had known as soldiers of the Wehrmacht. The regulations of the War Department required that enemy prisoners receive the same basic rations as American troops, and the numbers were staggering when compared to the conditions in Germany. Each German POW in the United States consumed, on average, 3,200 to 3,500 calories per day. This included white bread, fresh milk, meat twice daily, eggs several times a week, butter, sugar, vegetables, and coffee made from real imported beans. At the same moment, Wehrmacht soldiers fighting in Russia or Italy survived on less than 1,200 calories a day, often from stale black bread, thin soup, and small scraps of horse meat. The prisoners could not believe the abundance. In Texas camps, breakfast trays carried scrambled eggs, bacon, bread with jam, and hot coffee. Lunches included beef stew or pork chops, potatoes, green beans, and desserts like pies. Supper often meant chicken, rice, vegetables, and fresh fruit. There was so much food that camp kitchens were required by regulation to prepare 10% more than needed to ensure no prisoner went hungry. The surplus was simply discarded, if uneaten. Former POWs recalled the trauma of throwing away bread or meat into garbage bins, knowing their families in Hamburg or Cologne were starving. "I wept as I carried pans of untouched bread to the trash," one prisoner later confessed, "because my mother at home would have killed for a single slice." Beyond the rations, the prisoners were also given the opportunity to buy extras from camp canteens with their labor wages. They earned 80 cents per day working in agricultural fields or sawmills, money they could use to purchase cigarettes, chocolate bars, and bottles of Coca-Cola. For many, the first time they held an American dollar bill or exchanged coins for candy felt surreal. They were captives, yet they had more purchasing power than free civilians in Germany, where inflation and shortages rendered Reichsmarks nearly useless. Some men wrote home describing the absurdity of earning money while being held as prisoners. Their families often assumed the letters were censored propaganda, because it seemed impossible that enemy soldiers would be treated so generously. The logistical machinery that made this possible was immense. Every camp had walk-in refrigerators, industrial ovens, and electric mixers. Meat arrived by refrigerated train cars from Midwestern stockyards. Milk and butter came in insulated trucks from local dairies. Vegetables and fruit were delivered in crates from farms that seemed endless to the Germans who labored there. The waste alone surpassed their comprehension. Prisoners assigned to kitchen duty saw bins filled with potato peels, bread crusts, and leftover meat scraps, quantities that would have fed entire German families for a week. In Germany, children dug through trash for crumbs. In America, enemy soldiers dumped surplus into garbage cans. Some officers tried to rationalize what they saw, insisting that it must be temporary, that surely America would collapse under the strain of war. But the evidence around them contradicted every hope. They saw trains arriving daily with supplies, trucks distributing food without pause, camp kitchens functioning with mechanical precision. They realized that the abundance was not a show, but a system, one so powerful that it provided luxuries even to those who had fought against it. The psychological blow was relentless. Each plate of white bread, each cup of coffee, each bottle of Coca-Cola was a reminder that they were living better as prisoners than as soldiers of the Reich. Letters home became the most painful ritual of captivity. The Germans were allowed to write twice a month, and every letter carried the same undertone: disbelief, guilt, and fear that their words would not be believed. Some wrote cautiously, afraid of censorship, describing sufficient food and decent conditions. Others dared to be more direct, hinting that they were eating better in America than their families were in Hamburg or Dresden. Wives and mothers often dismissed such claims as propaganda. How could it be true that men in the hands of the enemy were receiving white bread, meat, and sugar, while children at home survived on potatoes and acorn coffee? To believe the letters would mean accepting that Nazi propaganda had been lying for years, and that was almost too much to bear. One prisoner's diary captured the torment. "I sat with a bottle of Coca-Cola in my hand," he wrote in 1943, "and thought of my son in Dresden. He has never tasted real coffee, and here I drink American sugar water as though it were nothing. What kind of father am I, living in comfort while my child starves?" Others remembered their wives boiling beets and barley to make ersatz coffee, rationing sugar so strictly that a single cube was saved for Christmas. In contrast, camp kitchens served cakes and pies thick with sugar and cream. The gulf between the POW camps of Texas and the bomb-shattered cities of Germany widened with every meal. The numbers were merciless. In 1944, German civilians received weekly rations of 250 grams of bread, 100 grams of meat, and perhaps 20 grams of fat, if they were lucky. By comparison, American POW camp menus allocated nearly a pound of bread per man per day, half a pound of meat, and generous servings of butter and jam. German families counted calories like treasure, while their captured sons grew heavier behind barbed wire. Prisoners later admitted that the irony was unbearable. One recalled that when he looked in a mirror in 1944, he realized he had gained weight in captivity. "I was ashamed," he said. "My mother wrote that she had lost 20 pounds because there was not enough food. I grew fat while she grew thin." Even the price of luxuries told the story. In Germany, if black market sugar could be found, it cost weeks of wages. In American camps, a bottle of Coca-Cola cost 5 cents, the same as for American soldiers and children. The prisoners could buy it with the wages they earned picking cotton or cutting timber. For them, the coin itself seemed unreal. How could it be that enemies who had bombed their cities would hand them money to buy sweets? Some men stopped writing about these details altogether, fearing their families would despise them for living in such relative comfort while their loved ones struggled to survive the winter. The psychological impact deepened as they imagined the life of their families contrasted with their own. They pictured bombed-out streets of Cologne, women queuing for hours in the cold to receive turnips, children fainting in classrooms from hunger. Then they looked at their own situation, sleeping in wooden barracks with electric lights, eating 3 meals a day, and sipping Coca-Cola from a glass bottle. The dissonance gnawed at them. They were prisoners, yet they were freer from want than the people they loved. That realization carried a sting sharper than captivity itself. As months passed inside the camps, the prisoners began to understand that Coca-Cola was not an isolated indulgence, but a symptom of something much larger. The bottles they held in their hands were connected to the same industrial machine that produced Liberty ships in days, bombers in hours, and rifles in numbers so vast that even after arming millions of soldiers, America still had the capacity to supply prisoners with abundance. What had seemed like mockery turned into revelation. If the United States could spend sugar, glass, and transportation on soda for enemies, then what must its armies in the field receive? If a prisoner in Texas could drink Coca-Cola every week, then an American pilot over Europe must have been supplied with food, fuel, and spare parts beyond measure. The arithmetic was cruel, but undeniable. Germany had entered a war against a nation with resources that were not just greater, but almost infinite by comparison. The statistics confirmed what the prisoners sensed. By 1944, America was producing 2,500 fighter aircraft every month, while Germany managed barely 1,000 and lost more than that in combat. The Liberty ship program launched a vessel every 42 hours, while German U-boat yards required months to complete a single submarine. In steel, the United States poured more than 80 million tons annually. Germany, less than half. Even food production told the story. American wheat harvests reached more than 1.2 billion bushels in 1943, enough not only to feed the nation, but to supply Britain, the Soviet Union, and to provide full rations for hundreds of thousands of Axis prisoners. These were not abstract figures to the POWs. They tasted them in every meal, they held them in every bottle, they saw them in every trainload of supplies that arrived at the camps without fail. Gradually, the pride of the Afrika Korps veterans cracked. They had once believed that German discipline and fighting spirit could overcome American softness. Now they saw that American abundance had a hardness of its own, one measured in factories, assembly lines, and logistics. The camp guards did not boast about it. They did not need to. The evidence lay in the refrigerators, in the overflowing trash bins, in the endless supply of cigarettes and candy bars, in the casual waste of food that would have been unimaginable in Hamburg or Berlin. Some prisoners tried to cling to Nazi ideology, insisting that such plenty was decadent and would weaken the enemy. But as they watched train after train thunder past carrying grain, coal, and automobiles, they knew the truth. Decadence had become power, and abundance itself was a weapon more decisive than any tank or aircraft. For many, the realization came with a strange mixture of relief and despair. Relief, because captivity in America meant survival, not starvation. Despair, because the war they had once believed was winnable had clearly been lost long before they surrendered. One officer later recalled, "When I drank my first Coca-Cola, I thought it was just a curiosity. After months of watching the supplies arrive without end, I realized it was a verdict." We had been sentenced by mathematics, by industry, by production capacity that no courage could overcome. That understanding spread quietly through the camps, carried in whispered conversations at night, written in diaries, and hidden in letters home. The prisoners had come face to face with the true engine of American victory, and it was not the rifle or the tank, but the factory that never stopped. Christmas of 1943 crystallized everything the prisoners had been struggling to understand. In camps across Texas, Oklahoma, and Mississippi, American church groups and civic organizations sent gifts to the men who only months earlier had tried to kill their sons. Packages arrived filled with homemade cookies, chocolate, cigarettes, and even bottles of Coca-Cola tied with ribbons. The camp kitchens prepared turkey dinners with stuffing, mashed potatoes, vegetables, cranberry sauce, and pumpkin pie. Some camps served ice cream made on site, a luxury the prisoners had not seen in years. For the Germans, the shock was almost unbearable. They sat at long tables under electric lights, eating a holiday feast that their families back home could not have imagined, and listened to choirs singing carols in German. One prisoner later admitted, "I realized then that we were not only defeated in war, but in civilization itself. They had so much that they could even share it with enemies." The bottle of Coca-Cola on the Christmas table became a symbol in their minds. It was no longer just a drink. It was proof of America's industrial scale, proof of a society so wealthy that it could waste what Germany treasured, proof that the war had been lost not on the battlefield, but in the arithmetic of production. A single factory in Georgia could flood the continent with syrup. Glass plants in Pennsylvania produced bottles by the millions, sugar poured in from the Caribbean, and refrigerated trucks carried the finished product across thousands of miles. No matter how many planes Germany built, no matter how many soldiers it sent to the front, it could never match the system that made Coca-Cola ordinary. When the war ended and the prisoners were repatriated, many carried this memory home with them. They told their families incredible stories, that they had drunk soda every week, that they had eaten white bread every day, that they had grown heavier in captivity while their children had starved in Germany. At first, these tales sounded like fantasy. But as the years passed and American products entered West Germany, Coca-Cola returned in 1949. Ice cream parlors opened in every city. Supermarkets appeared filled with candy bars and canned goods. Their stories were confirmed. The memory of drinking Coca-Cola behind barbed wire became a prophecy of the future, a reminder that abundance, not conquest, was the true foundation of power. For the men who had once believed in Hitler's promises, the final verdict was clear. The Reich had gambled against an industrial giant and lost. The mocking laughter about America's so-called decadence had turned into silence before the reality of American abundance. A prisoner summed it up decades later. When I drank Coca-Cola as a captive, I knew the war was over. If they could give us that, they could give their soldiers anything. We were finished. The bottle in his hand had been more than a refreshment. It had been a sentence. The quiet but undeniable proof that Germany's fate was sealed. Thus, the story of Coca-Cola in the prison camps stands as a parable of the entire war. America did not win by starving enemies or crushing them with brutality. It won by producing so much that even prisoners tasted the surplus. The arsenal of democracy was not only bombers and tanks. It was also the soda fountains, the candy bars, the endless fields of wheat and sugar, the factories that ran without pause. To the German POWs, the Coca-Cola bottle was the moment they realized that no amount of sacrifice or ideology could defeat a society that turned abundance into its greatest weapon. In that sweet fizzing drink lay the death sentence of the Third Reich, a quiet verdict delivered not with a rifle shot, but with a bottle cap.